never thought a simple weekend at my best friend's house would change my life forever. But looking back, maybe I should have noticed the signs. The way my heart raced when I stepped inside, the strange tension in the air, and the presence of someone I never expected to meet. It was supposed to be an escape, a break from the suffocating silence of my own home, where my dad barely looked at me and my mom only spoke in half-hearted murmurs. So when Ryan invited me over for the weekend, I said yes without hesitation. Ryan and I had been best friends since middle school. He was the confident one, the life of the party, the guy who always had a sarcastic remark ready. Me? I was quieter, more observant. We balanced each other out in a way that just made sense. Spending the night at his place was nothing new. We'd had countless sleepovers, gaming marathons, and midnight snack raids. But this time, something was different. The moment I stepped inside his house, I felt it. Maybe it was the dim lighting, the scent of freshly brewed coffee mixed with something deeper, cologne, musk, something that sent a strange shiver down my spine. Or maybe it was the way the air itself felt charged, heavy with an energy I couldn't place. Ryan's house was warm and familiar, but tonight it felt off. And then I saw him, Mr. Carter, Ryan's dad. I'd met him before, of course. He was always polite, always composed, a businessman, sharp-dressed and sharp-witted. But he was usually too busy to be around when I visited. This time, though, he was home. And he wasn't just passing through. He was watching. His gaze landed on me the second I stepped through the door. Not in a casual, oh hey, it's my son's friend way. No, it was something else. His eyes held a weight that pinned me in place. Deep brown, piercing, unreadable. The kind of look that made me feel seen in a way I wasn't sure I was ready for. Hey kid, he said, his voice smooth, almost teasing. Didn't know you were coming over. Ryan rolled his eyes. Yeah, Dad, because I totally have to. Send you a formal invitation every time Noah crashes here. I forced a chuckle, but my throat felt tight. I didn't know why. Mr. Carter smirked, leaning against the counter, his arms crossed over his chest. He was relaxed, casual, but something about him made my stomach twist in a way I didn't understand. Make yourself at home, he said, still watching me. And I did. Or at least, I tried to. But as the night went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. That this weekend wouldn't be like the others, that somehow I had stepped into something I wasn't prepared for, and that maybe, just maybe, Mr. Carter had other plans. Ryan's house was familiar, yet tonight, it felt different. Maybe it was just me, overthinking, reading too much into things. But as I followed Ryan up to his room, I couldn't shake the weight of Mr. Carter's gaze. We spent the evening like we always did, gaming, trash-talking, laughing over stupid inside jokes. But even as Ryan shouted at the screen, I found my focus slipping. I was restless, distracted. My mind kept drifting back downstairs. Eventually, Ryan crashed out first, sprawled across his bed, controller still in his hand. I wasn't tired. Not really. The house was too quiet now, the night stretching too long. I needed a drink, something to shake off the strange buzz under my skin. Slipping out of Ryan's room, I crept downstairs, careful not to wake his mom. The kitchen was dark, except for the faint glow from the fridge as I opened it. I grabbed a water bottle and turned, and nearly jumped out of my skin. Mr. Carter stood in the doorway watching me. Oh, sorry, I stammered, my voice coming out too soft, too breathy. Didn't think anyone was awake. He didn't move, didn't break eye contact. The dim light from the fridge cast shadows across his sharp features, making him look even more unreadable. Couldn't sleep? He asked, voice smooth, quiet. I swallowed. Yeah, just thirsty. He hummed, stepping further into the kitchen, closing the distance between us in a way that felt unintentional, but also deliberate. He opened a cabinet reaching for a glass, and for a split second, his arm brushed mine. A fleeting touch. Barely there, but I felt it. I felt it like a static charge, like a spark dancing over my skin. I stepped back, gripping the water bottle tighter, trying to ignore the way my pulse had kicked up. He poured himself a drink, taking a slow sip, his gaze never leaving mine. "You come here a lot," he said, setting the glass down. I nodded. "Yeah. Ryan and I have been friends forever." His lips curved into something almost amused. "I know." Something about the way he said it made my stomach twist, like he'd been paying more attention than I realized. Silence stretched between us, thick with something I couldn't name. He was standing too close, his presence too heavy, and yet I couldn't move, couldn't look away. "Your parents okay with you staying over so much?" he asked. I hesitated, a beat too long. He caught it. "Yeah," I lied. He didn't press, but his eyes flickered with something, understanding, curiosity, something deeper. Then, as if sensing he'd lingered too long, he exhaled and took a step back, the tension breaking just enough for me to breathe again. "Well," he said, voice lower now. "Try to get some rest." I nodded, turning to leave, but as I passed him I felt it again, that electricity in the air, a pull I didn't understand. I forced myself to keep walking. But even when I was back upstairs, lying in the dark next to Ryan's steady breathing, I couldn't shake the way Mr. Carter had looked at me, or the way, for just a second, I had looked back. I told myself it was nothing, just a weird moment in the kitchen, nothing more. But as the weekend stretched on, I kept noticing him, and worse. I kept feeling noticed. It wasn't obvious, not really. Mr. Carter wasn't the type to make things obvious, but it was there. The way his gaze lingered a second too long when I walked into a room, the way his voice lowered just slightly when he spoke to me, the way I became hyper-aware of him whenever he was nearby. And then there were the moments. Small, fleeting, easy to dismiss. Like Saturday morning when Ryan slept in and I wandered downstairs to find Mr. Carter already awake, sipping coffee at the kitchen table. "You're up early," he said, glancing at me over the rim of his mug. I shrugged, rubbing the back of my neck. "Didn't sleep much." He gestured toward the coffee pot. "You drink?" Sometimes." "Sit," he said, pushing out the chair across from him. I hesitated, but then I sat. He poured me a cup, watching as I took a tentative sip. Bitter. Strong. "Not your thing?" I shook my head. "No, it's good." He smirked like he knew I was lying, and then we just sat there, drinking in silence. But it wasn't awkward. If anything, it felt comfortable, which was strange because I'd never really spent time alone with him before. After a while, he asked, "Ryan tell you I used to play football?" I shook my head. "College. Almost went pro." I raised a brow. "What happened?" He exhaled, rolling his mug between his palms. "Tore my ACL in my last season. That was that." There was something in his voice, something heavy. "Do you miss it?" I asked quietly. A pause. Then a small, wistful chuckle. "Every damn day." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. We didn't talk much after that, but when I stood to leave, I felt his eyes on me. Not in a bad way, just in a way. It kept happening. Little things, a glance held for just a beat too long. A brush of fingers when I passed him something. A casual touch on my shoulder that lingered just slightly longer than necessary. And the worst part? I noticed everything. Like later that afternoon when Ryan and I were heading out to meet some friends. I was tying my sneakers in the hallway when Mr. Carter walked past, pausing just behind me. "You need new shoes," he murmured. I frowned, looking down at them. "What?" "They're worn out," he said, his voice low, almost amused. "You run in those?" "Sometimes." He made a sound, something between a chuckle and a sigh. And then, before I could process it, he reached down, fingers grazing the back of my calf as he adjusted the laces I'd just tied. My whole body went still. It was such a small thing, such a nothing thing, and yet it felt like everything. When he stood, his hand barely skimmed my shoulder, his fingers trailing just slightly before pulling away. I swallowed hard, avoiding his eyes as I mumbled, "We should go." That night I couldn't sleep. Again. Ryan was out cold, sprawled on his stomach, mouth slightly open. I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts a tangled mess. Eventually, I gave up. Slipping downstairs, I grabbed a glass of water, trying to shake, the weird tension coiling in my chest. Another sleepless night? His voice sent a jolt through me. I turned to find him leaning against the doorway, arms crossed. He looked relaxed. Barefoot, sweatpants, a fitted t-shirt. It was the first time I'd seen him look casual, less composed. "Yeah," I muttered, clearing my throat. "Guess so." He nodded, stepping further into the kitchen. "Happens to me, too." I bit my lip, debating whether to say anything, but then, "Why?" He looked at me, and for a second I thought he wouldn't answer. But then he exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Too much in my head," he admitted. I swallowed. "Same." Silence. Then, "What's in yours?" he asked, tilting his head. I hesitated. But something about the way he looked at me, steady, expectant, made me want to answer. "Just stuff," I said. "College, my parents, not knowing what the hell I'm doing with my life." I huffed a quiet laugh. Usual teenage existential crisis, I guess. His lips quirked. "Sounds about right." "What about you?" I asked. His smirk faded. For a second I thought he'd deflect, but then he said, "Regret." That single word hit harder than I expected. I didn't ask what he meant, maybe because I already knew. "Does it get better?" I asked. He considered me for a long moment. Then, quietly, "Sometimes." And for some reason, that sometimes made my chest ache. We didn't say much after that, just sat there in the quiet, sipping our drinks. But when he stood to leave, he hesitated, for just a moment. And then, just barely, his hand brushed my arm, a deliberate touch, a question left unspoken, and then he was gone. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop feeling it, and it wasn't just me. The next morning he was different, more distant, back to his usual composed self. Like the night before had never happened, and maybe that should have been the end of it. Maybe I should have let it go. But then, as I was leaving that afternoon, heading out the door with Ryan, I glanced back and Mr. Carter was watching me, not in a casual way, not in a my son's friend way, in a way that made my stomach tighten, in a way that made my skin prickle, in a way that made me realize this wasn't in my head, this was real, and that was dangerous. Ryan's house felt different now, maybe because I had changed, or maybe because I knew, deep down, that whatever was happening, whatever this was, couldn't keep happening. I told myself to ignore it, to act normal. But that was easier said than done when every glance, every passing moment, every accidental brush of skin felt charged with something I wasn't ready to name. I tried to avoid him. It was the only thing that made sense. But avoidance only worked when the other person wasn't waiting. It was late. Ryan had fallen asleep mid-movie, leaving me stuck on the couch. I could have stayed, forced myself to sleep. Instead, I found myself standing in the hallway, barely breathing as I caught sight of him near the stairs. He hesitated when he saw me, but only for a second. Then, slowly, he walked closer. "You okay?" His voice was quiet, almost cautious. I nodded. Lied. "Yeah." He studied me for a moment, his gaze unreadable. Then he glanced toward the back door. An unspoken invitation. I should have ignored it. Instead, I followed. The night air was cool, the backyard dimly lit by the glow from the kitchen window. He leaned against the porch railing, arms crossed, watching me. "You've been avoiding me," he said, voice low. I swallowed, looking away. "No, I haven't." A quiet huff of laughter. "Right." Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. I forced myself to speak. Whatever's happening, it shouldn't." I shook my head, words failing me. "I know," he said simply, and for some reason that hurt. I met his gaze, and for the first time, I let myself see it. The thing I'd been pretending wasn't there. It was terrifying. "Then why does it feel like this?" I whispered. His jaw tensed. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Because sometimes things happen that shouldn't." I hated that answer. I hated how much I understood it. My throat felt tight. "This is wrong." He didn't move, didn't argue. But there was something in his eyes, something almost sad. "I know," he said again. Something cracked inside me. Frustration, confusion, anger at myself for feeling anything at all. "Then stop looking at me like that." His brows furrowed. "Like what?" Like you want something from me." My voice wavered, but I didn't stop. "Like this isn't a mistake." He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "You think this is easy for me?" I froze. "You think I want this?" His voice was quiet but rough, like he was holding back something too big to contain. "Because I don't. I don't." He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "But then you walk into a room, and suddenly I can't think straight, and I hate it. I hate how much I notice you." The words hit like a punch to the gut. I stepped back, my breath shallow. "We can't do this." He nodded, but the way his hands clenched at his sides told me it wasn't that simple. I turned to leave, needing to get away, to put distance between us. But before I could take another step, he said my name. I stopped, waited. Silence. And then, softer this time, almost broken. "I know." I walked inside, my heart pounding. But even as I lay awake in the dark, I could still feel the weight of his gaze. And I knew this wasn't over. The tension had settled between us like an unspoken truth, heavy and suffocating. We avoided each other for days, but avoidance wasn't enough when every glance still carried weight. Every accidental touch felt like a match against dry wood, threatening to ignite something we both feared. It all came to a head one evening when I found myself in the kitchen, hands gripping the counter as I tried to steady my breathing. Ryan's dad had been distant, avoiding my eyes just as much as I had been avoiding his. But then he walked in. I stiffened, pretending to focus on my phone, but I could feel his presence behind me, close enough that I could hear his breathing. "Are we really going to do this?" His voice was quiet, but there was something raw beneath it. I swallowed hard. "Do what?" "This." I turned slightly, and when I met his eyes, it felt like standing on the edge of something dangerous. "Pretend like it's not there." I opened my mouth, but no words came, and then, like fate had a cruel sense of humor, the power went out. The kitchen plunged into darkness, and for a second, all I could hear was the hum of my pulse in my ears. Then a clap of thunder rolled through the sky, rattling the windows. A storm, a real one raging outside, but the storm between us was worse. Before I could move, a sharp knock sounded from the front door. Ryan's mom opened it, and a gust of wind carried in the rain along with the man standing in the doorway. I recognized him instantly. Liam. My ex. He was soaked, shivering slightly as he ran a hand through his wet hair. "I need to talk to you." The words sent my stomach plummeting. I heard Ryan's dad shift behind me, felt the shift in the air, the sudden tension thick enough to choke on. "This isn't a good time," I said, voice tight. Liam's eyes flickered to Ryan's dad, then back to me. please. I hesitated, but before I could answer, Ryan's dad stepped forward. His voice was calm, measured, but there was something sharp in it. I think he said it's not a good time. Liam scoffed, crossing his arms. And who are you? To decide? The room felt impossibly small. Liam, just go, I said. Not until you hear me out. Ryan's dad moved again, this time stepping slightly in front of me. Protective. He asked you to leave. Liam let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. I get it now. He turned his gaze to me, his expression unreadable. This is why you ended things, isn't it? My breath caught. Liam's gaze flicked back to Ryan's dad, then to me. Be honest with yourself. With him. Ryan's dad was still, barely breathing, but I could see the way his fists clenched at his sides. The silence was unbearable. And then finally, I spoke. Just go, Liam. A pause. Then with one last look, Liam shook his head and walked back into the storm. The door shut behind him, sealing the tension between us. Ryan's dad turned slowly, and for the first time, I saw something crack in his expression. Something unguarded. You ended things with him because of me? His voice was barely above a whisper. I exhaled shakily. I don't know. He stepped closer. I didn't move. Tell me to stop, he murmured. I should have. Instead, I closed the distance between us. The moment our lips met, everything else, Liam, the storm, the fear, faded away. And for the first time, I stopped running. The rain had stopped by morning, but the air still smelled of it, fresh, clean, like a beginning. I sat on the back porch, knees pulled up to my chest, watching the way the sunlight dripped through the trees. The storm had knocked down a few branches, left the yard a little messy. But the world hadn't ended, and neither had we. The door creaked open behind me, but I didn't turn. I felt him before he even spoke. You always do that, Ryan's dad said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. Do what? Sit in the aftermath like you're waiting for something. I swallowed, fingers tightening around my legs. Maybe I was. The wooden steps groaned as he lowered himself beside me. For a while, we just sat there letting the silence say the things we couldn't. Then finally, he spoke. I was scared. I glanced at him. He was staring straight ahead, hands clasped loosely between his knees. So was I admitted. He nodded, like that made sense. Like fear was something we'd both been holding on to for so long that we didn't know how to let go. Then, slowly, he turned to face me. I don't want to be afraid anymore. His voice was steady, certain, and I don't want to hide. My breath hitched. He reached into his pocket, pulled out something small, and placed it in my hand. A key. I stared at it, my heart pounding. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Move in with me. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a plea. It was a statement, one he wasn't taking back. I should have hesitated. Should have thought about what it meant, how complicated this was. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't want to think. I wanted to choose. I closed my fingers around the key, feeling its weight, feeling his weight, the way he was finally giving himself to this, to us. Okay, I whispered. A slow, relieved smile spread across his face, and before I could say anything else, he was pulling me into his arms, holding me like he never wanted to let go. And maybe he wouldn't have to. Because in the end, love wasn't about fear. It was about choosing someone, even when it was hard, even when it didn't make sense, even when the world told you it was a mistake, and I was done running from my choice. I pressed my forehead against his, eyes slipping shut. I'm I. Not waiting anymore, I murmured, and when he kissed me, I knew, this time neither of us would walk away,